James, thank you so much for joining me here today on the show. We are here to talk about neuroscience and learning, which is going to be the first part of our interview today. So let me just jump straight into it. How does neuroscience help us learn more effectively and retain information?
Well, Jit, thank you very much for the opportunity and for the question. You know, neuroscience is a broad area, and there are several parts of it that have to do with learning and memory. There are structures associated with learning and memory, and there's actually techniques that are associated with learning and memory. For example, on the structure side, the hippocampus, which is a part of the brain that actually consolidates and holds memory. Learning, there's an area of the cortex that's critical in terms of learning. What are some of the things that impact learning? One is your ability to practice. The other is whether the materials that you're learning are important to you. We found that there's a huge component that has to do with socialization. We actually can learn from each other. And then the last, and the one that I think is probably the most important, is the ability to experiment with the materials that you're learning. It's very often that you get the right answer the first time. What we find is that when you test, perform an operation, test again, perform another operation, it helps to consolidate the materials that you're actually looking at.
Okay. How does that then affect, like, for example, retaining information? Because that's one of the questions I often get from people when it's learning. You know, they want to remember stuff. They want to remember stuff, whether it's for exams or tests and all that. But is it really a priority to have a better memory?
Well, having a good memory is important.
Yeah.
And there are two things that actually help in terms of your memory. One is if the material is important to you, and that's why we emphasize emotional connection to the material that you're learning. If there's an emotional connection to the material, it tends to be more sticky.
Okay.
You tend to retain it much more. We've all sat in classrooms that were boring.
Yep.
You're less engaged, and 2 minutes after you walk out, you can't remember anything.
You're bringing back a lot of memories.
But we also can remember those speakers or those occasions where something really struck us, where it was important to us. It actually triggered not so much remembering, but it triggered an emotion. And that emotion, coupled with or paired with the thing that you're learning, makes it much more sticky, makes it easier to recall. So that's one. The second is, quite frankly, practice. Practice, practice, practice. When you practice something, it becomes a habit. When it becomes a habit, it's much more easier to retain.
So then what then? Like, for example, students who are sitting in a classroom who have got no emotional connection to math or science or physics or biology, but they still have to be there, they have to still learn, they still have to be good at it, because our academic system is based on tests and results, right? So how then do they, retain information better?
I can understand that. There were courses that I took in the past that had much less emotional connection to me, and it is a challenge to learn that. And that's where the practice comes in. You can rely on things like mnemonic devices to help you remember and retain the information. Once again, working with others also helps in terms of the learning and retention. There's a concept that's called scaffolding. It's like building a scaffold in a building. And when you're paired with different people, you build on the information of the people that are in your group. The social connection also makes it fun. Having fun during the learning process is also something that's important.
So bottom line, try not to study alone.
I think that studying with a group is actually facilitative.
That's nice. Cool. James, as I was doing a bit of research, for our interview today, and when going through, articles and research around neuroscience and learning, one particular term popped up, which was kind of new to me, and it's neuroplasticity, right? So I figured, who better to ask than you, since I'm already going to be sitting here with you. So what is neuroplasticity? Neuroplasticity. See, I can't even pronounce the word yet. That's how new it is.
The brain's an incredible organism. It's quite amazing. It's made up of a number of interconnections, Jit. And the concept of neuroplasticity has to do with the ability of the brain to change.
Okay.
and to realign its structure based on outside stimulation or learning for that matter. So neuroplasticity has to do with the ability for the brain to actually take in new information. It changes itself so it learns that information and it retains it.
So is that something that happens naturally within us, or is it something that we can is there something we can do to promote neuroplasticity within us?
We have the capability, so it is something that's natural. And can you promote it? Absolutely. By engaging in behaviors that you repeat similar processes, something like reading. You'll increase your neuroplasticity by reading. The more that you read, the more your brain will change to take in that kind of information. Practicing different concepts or different activities, it actually changes the way the brain is structured.
Okay.
So once again, you develop habits.
So what are some bad habits then when it comes to learning, right, in terms of neuroplasticity and neuroscience? Because we've been talking about some of the good stuff, but what are some of the bad stuff that we do that now goes against promoting learning?
I think probably one of the habits that are less effective is the concept of multitasking. People think that they're very good at multitasking, doing many things at one time. And the research shows that people are actually not good at multitasking. Some people are very good at switching. So they're able to concentrate on something and then switch over to something else and concentrate on that thing. But the concept of concentrating on multiple things, the brain isn't as effective in that. So what I would suggest is if you want to learn something, focus in on that thing that you're trying to learn. Don't become distracted. And you're more inclined to learn that information and retain that information as opposed to trying to do multiple things at one time.
So it's always better to focus on one thing for short periods of time, but give it your undivided attention rather than try to, like, just say, study for an hour, learn something for an hour, but you're also checking your phone and having something on the TV and engage with something else, right?
Well, different people have different capacities for concentration.
Okay.
For me, I find it more effective to concentrate in short periods of time over time, making sure that I get rest. Rest is important to learning. Rest is also important to retaining. But if I like something, if there's something that I find particularly enjoyable, I can get lost in it and I can spend quite a bit of time on it and I don't feel the fatigue and I actually am absorbing the information that comes in.
I like that you brought up rest just now. I'm going to get back to you on that, right? But before I ask you a little bit more about the impact of rest on our brains and learning, you shared a little bit about how emotions affect our learning ability. Like if we have an emotional anchor to the subject that we're having, then the learning becomes better. But there is one emotion that I think also can work against us, which is stress. And very often stress and learning is quite synonymous. So how does stress affect our ability to learn?
Stress is something that is natural. It's something that we all experience. And it's something that at actually low levels is quite facilitative to learning. Athletes, for example, when they're under, moderate amounts of stress, they actually perform quite well. It helps them to focus. It can be very motivating. It's when stress begins to elevate that it begins to have very negative effects, both physically and cognitively.
Okay.
So the idea is not that you have to remove every bit of stress in the learning process. At low level, stress is actually okay. It's motivating. I think we've all experienced that where we might be a little bit nervous, a little bit under stress, and it actually focuses our attention. It can be motivating. But when it becomes too much, then it starts to be demotivating. You start to lose your focus. You lose your concentration. You lose your ability to learn.
All right, but how then do we draw the line? Like what's low level, and how do we know not to get it to high level?
Well, there are some things that you can do to actually, if stress seems to be too high, to dial it back and to mitigate it. One is deep breathing. If you feel like you're in a situation where stress is starting to pile up, One behavior is actually taking measured deep breaths. Posture, sitting up straight, putting your shoulders back. These things actually cue the body, prepare it to be more relaxed, more calm. There are other things that you can do outside of the situation. Getting enough sleep, getting enough rest. Even things like nutrition, which you wouldn't think about. All those things that are around you, that you're not in the moment, help to reduce stress. When you put those things all together, it makes it much easier to control stress and to make sure that you're able to use stress to be a motivator as opposed to a demotivator.
Very cool. James, you talked about rest just now. Okay, so now's my question about when it comes to rest, right? What's your take on burning the midnight oil when you're trying to learn something?
Well, I'm guilty of doing that and having done it in the past, but it is not the ideal way. There's occasions where you will have to maybe burn that midnight oil, but it's not healthy. There's correlations, Jit, with low sleep and actually cognitive decline.
Okay.
When I used to work for the Department of Defense, one of the areas that I worked in was in sleep research. And we would see how soldiers perform as they have less and less sleep. And reaction time was significantly affected negatively when soldiers had less sleep. So we know that there's a correlation between lack of sleep and physical performance, but more and more research is showing that it's not just physical performance, it's also cognitive performance.
What then would be an ideal amount of sleep? Is there a recommended guide, or is it, again, different from person to person?
Yeah. The research, you'll see variations in the amount of sleep. Most of the research would suggest that you should get somewhere between 6 and 8 hours of sleep. And results will vary depending on the individual. But the surprising thing is that for a majority of the population globally, you get significantly less than 6 hours of sleep.
Yeah.
And that is not healthy long term. You get spikes in cortisol levels in the body. Stress levels, stressor hormones actually increase with the lack of sleep.
What about taking naps between learning? Does that help with learning and retention itself?
Taking naps in general is a good thing. It allows the body to rest. It's the body signaling that you need relaxation, you need time off, you need to take a break. And when you do sleep, there's a number of things that happen. Number one is you begin to consolidate information and you consolidate memory. So that's one of the things that's important in sleep. The other thing is, and you've heard this, it's anecdotal, but it's also been shown in research, that you're able to actually continue to process information. So you've heard the stories of people that sleep and wake up and have breakthrough ideas or breakthrough discoveries or have an innovative thought. That's not accidental. The brain is still working during the REM phase of sleep or the rapid eye movement phase of sleep.
Yeah, I've actually experienced that before. Now that you mention it, like many times, especially sometimes when I'm stuck with an idea or problem, right? And then I just give up. I'm like, you know what? I'm done. I'm going to work on this tomorrow. I'm just going to sleep. And then middle of the night, I just wake up with a thought. And that's part of the reason why I always have a notebook beside me with a pen, because at night here I am getting up and scribbling stuff down.
I do the exact same thing. I've gotten to the habit now where I do have a notebook by the side of my bed, because there have been those occasions where I've had a problem that I thought was intractable before I went to bed. In the middle of the evening or first thing in the morning when I get up, all of a sudden I'll have a breakthrough or a different perspective on that idea, write it down quickly in a notebook. And it's amazing how many times I go back to those ideas. Sometimes it's unrelated to something that was a problem. It's just something new and unique that I hadn't thought of. And it happens during sleep because you are processing information. You are actually looking at things differently. The brain is active.
You know, the other area where I get a lot of ideas, normally is in the shower, right? Like when I'm taking a nice hot shower with the water hitting my head, for some reason, right, ideas tend to flow. All right. Is there a reason for that?
I was going to say that I cannot give you a neuroscience explanation for why the shower
No,
is
it's not,
facilitative.
doesn't help with blood circulation or something. I don't know. I haven't quite figured it out, but there's a lot of guesswork. But I've really realized that
Okay.
with a hot shower, for some reason, the brain seems to work a little better.
So for your audience out there,
Yeah.
there's a dissertation problem that could be studied right now. Hot showers and creativity.
Yeah. Good thought. Maybe I should write that. Anyway, so James, before we end off the first part of our interview, which is neuroscience and learning, all right, I've got one last question, which I feel is an important question as well. You know, we are constantly learning, all right, good and bad things, good habits, bad habits, all right. Does the brain have the ability to unlearn bad habits? And if so, how do we do it?
You know, and this gets back somewhat to the whole concept of neuroplasticity. We have a tremendous capacity to learn. We have a tremendous capacity to retain information. Just to give you an example, the brain can actually hold and memorize about 2 petabytes of information. That's about 2 million gigabytes
That's a lot
of
of
information. Or to put it into context, that's about 4 billion books. So we have a tremendous capacity to learn information. But information evolves. The half-life of knowledge today is much shorter than it was even 10 years ago. So there will be things that we'll learn today that will be obsolete in 5 years. The brain has the capacity of adding in new information and sort of discarding that older information. So we have a tremendous capability in the function of the brain to not only take in information, to augment with new information and catalog older information.
So that's cool. So that means we do have that ability within us, all right? So we just need to utilize it.
Just
in the right
utilize
way.
it.
And the only way to do it is to keep learning.
Yes.
All right.
And it doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what your station is. You have the capacity to learn, to understand, and to grow your skills, your knowledge, your capability.
Yeah, I think I've heard that limiting belief before. Oh, I'm too old. You know, you can't teach what an old dog new tricks. You know, and people tend to use that as excuses, right? Yeah.
It can become a self-reinforcing prophecy. But the reality is that you actually have the capability to continue. Lifelong learning is something that you can do.
I read an article quite a while back, actually, on another concept called neurogenesis. Is it? I don't know. I mean, I've not really looked into it, but what I read was that the brain, there's a part of the brain that has the ability to continually grow brain cells. Right? It doesn't stop beyond infancy or childlike, but what promotes it is learning and reading especially, and that's what keeps people, you know, active, or at least brain active until even in the golden ages.
So I think what you're referring to, Jit, is the ability of the brain to make new connections.
Okay.
And that is something that the brain can continue to do. The more stimuli that you expose yourself to, the more connections that you make. And these connections, the fascinating thing about the brain is you can make connections between very disparate parts of the brain. So visual information may make connections with auditory information, and auditory can make connections to motor neurons that are associated with movement. And so you get these artists do tremendously interesting, beautiful things because of the interconnections that they make. Scientists make unbelievable discoveries because of the interconnections that they make.
Got it. James, I know I said last question just now, but I've already gone one question over the last question. But the more I talk to you about this topic, the more questions is coming up. But last question, right? And that's around this area, which is there a difference like between a visual learner and an auditory learner in that manner? Or, if let's just say I'm more visual, does that mean I should learn visually as compared to auditory?
There are people that are more predisposed to learning visually. There are some that are more predisposed to learning auditory materials or taking in and processing auditory materials. There are some people that are more predisposed to kinesthetic. Actually touching, feeling helps them understand and process. And then to add another level of complexity to it, different types of material, depending on what the material is being learned, may lend itself more to visual or more auditory. The matter of the fact is, Jit, you probably have capabilities on all of those, although you may lean towards one more than the others. So yes, there is something to the idea and the concept of visual, auditory, kinesthetic, but you have the capability of switching between any and all of those, depending on the material that you're learning.
Very cool. James, thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here with Dr. James here today, part of our interview on neuroscience and how neuroscience affects learning, motivation, and leadership. This is just part one of the interview. Keep a lookout for part two, which will be coming up soon. I'm going to be having a chat with James after this on that. So for all of you out there who have been following our channel, thank you so much for subscribing and listening to interviews like this. And if you have not subscribed, now is the best time to do it. And once again, keep a lookout for part two, which will be coming your way really soon. Okay, James, see you in the next part.
Thank you.